Okay.
All right, making sure we're good to go. Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Humanity Kansas Big Idea Presentation. I'm Freddie Gipp, enrolled member of the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma, Digital Programs Manager for Humanities Kansas, and your co-host, along with Dr. Valerie Mendoza, Director of the Title III Strengthening Institutions Grant at Washburn University. The Big Idea, which is a monthly online series that highlights fresh thinking on humanities topics through brief essays and online interviews. Last season highlighted Black scholars, emphasizing past and present work and how it has impacted their careers and communities. And for this season, we are transitioning our focus to elevate and explore Indigenous scholarship. Today's Big Idea presentation, titled Story as Medicine, focuses on how we can better examine a clear and more accurate way of a true approach to Indigenous storytelling and oral tradition. Joining us today is Dr. Rachel Jackson, Cherokee Nation, an assistant professor of Native American literatures and cultural studies and rhetoric and writing studies at the University of Oklahoma. Her research examines activists' rhetorical strategies and how they build collective action towards decolonial futures. Her community engagement projects focus on sustaining Native American languages and cultural literacies and forwarding Indigenous storytelling practices. Dr. Jackson is both a Ford Foundation Fellow and a Research Fellow with the Newberry Consortium on American Indian Studies. Dr. Jackson, thank you for joining us today. How is everything going?
Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here, and things are going well. Thank you, Freddie.
Yeah, definitely. So before we begin, the format of our discussion is very simple, as Dr. Mendoza and I will alternate on questions relating to your essay, career, and other relatable topics in today's Big Idea. And towards the end of the program, we will allow those in the audience to ask any questions through the webinar's Q&A and chat feature. Dr. Mendoza, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Freddie. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Jackson. I really enjoyed your Big Idea. It spoke to me. I have so many questions. I had to limit them to the time that we had. So my first one is, what are some stories that influence you from your childhood? Some of those early ones.
Yeah, I really do come from a family of storytellers, and there's of course a part of me that believes we all do. We're born into stories, and we're told stories, from the time that we're small. So the stories that continue to influence me in my work come from both my mother and my father's families, but in particular my mother's family, which is where I inherit my Cherokee descendancy from my mother's father. And, I remember growing up with stories of both his mother and his father. Their families were removed on the removal trail from northern Georgia. And some of the stories survived, some of the stories of these family members survived. But not very many. And so that made those that remained very precious. I had stories of my own great-grandfather, so my mother's grandfather, and he has been a presence in my life, even though, of course, he died well before even my own mother was born. And stories about him soothe me and comfort me. He was a stonemason in the Cowiskowee district in Cherokee territory prior to statehood. And his name was Joseph Van. And by all accounts, he was very, very gentle and very wise. And of course, strong as well. My great-grandmother died when my own grandfather was 7. And so my grandfather and his father raised the rest of the children. And the stories that I have about him are almost like brief moments from his life. My aunt, my mother's oldest sister, remembers him walking out on the front porch and praying and burning salt to protect the family. And that's not, you don't think of that. That may not be a story, but it is a story, right? It tells me so much about who he was, what his sort of spiritual orientation was, his ceremonial orientation. And so even a fragment such as that becomes a full story for me. So I would say stories about, my family. My mother used to tell Cherokee stories. She was an elementary school teacher, and so she was often invited to speak to different elementary schools, tell stories from our own oral tradition. And certainly one of my favorite stories from her was how Spider stole fire and brought it back to the people. Such a beautiful story of persistence, the persistence of a small, delicate creature using what she had to do what she could. So I would say oral tradition stories and family stories are the most meaningful kinds of stories in my own life that kind of carry me through.
Thank you for sharing that, because as you were speaking about your grandfather, it just gave me a sense of like knowing him as well, and that made me think of your essay and how you say stories are alive, right? Because I could really feel like, his presence and things like that. My grandfather was a Mason as well. So it made me start to think about him and, and his stories. So yeah, that's a great start to this discussion. So in your essay, you quote several authors, and you mentioned several Indigenous authors: Joy Harjo, poet laureate, Joe Bruchac, and Gerald Visner. Tell us a little bit about why each of those authors speaks to you and what you like about them.
Well, it's Joe Bruchac is I don't know, he's kind of like a grandfather figure in the world of Native literature. He is an Abenaki scholar himself, but he has made a career out of kind of building this encyclopedic knowledge of oral traditions from Indigenous cultures really throughout the continental United States and Alaska and Hawaii. And he is so gifted at the way he relays the stories. I use one of his books as a textbook. It's in and of itself, it's not a textbook, but it's called Our Stories Remember, American Indian History, Culture, and Values Through Storytelling. It was published in 2003. And in it, he just traces sort of the thematic, he creates kind of a thematic grouping of stories and pulls from, many different cultures to show the ways in which story empowers Indigenous peoples in the world in multiple ways, by teaching, right, by advocating, by negotiating. And I'm always awed by the way his book helps students, my undergraduate students who are largely non-Native, right, at the University of Oklahoma, to approach Native storytelling in a respectful way, and walk away from his book with a great deal of kind of insight into how storytelling lives in Indigenous lives. Gerald Visner has quite a reputation as well in Native studies. He, I would say, most famously, perhaps, he published a book, I think, in 2008 called Survivance. And it's actually, I have the whole title, Survivance: Narratives of Native Presence. And he did such work in this text to kind of shift the dialogue around Native cultures from absence to presence, and spoke so eloquently to why that is critical, why that's critical in scholarship, that we become conscious of not reinscribing the language of disappearance, right? The language of erasure. And survivance was a theory that he offered as a way of establishing ongoing Native presence and cultural persistence. Joy Harjo, my gosh, in my conversations with Leslie leading up to our dialogue today, I described her as a being, right? She is a force for good in the world. But she's not only a being, she's a doing. She's so active as a writer and an artist. And certainly her role as U.S. Poet Laureate, the first Native American to hold that position, and as a Native American woman, no less. And she is giving voice to Indigenous worldviews and perspectives and histories on such a large global stage that you can't help but be inspired by her. You can't help but admire her, the grace and eloquence that she brings to that role while speaking truth to power and uplifting Native peoples.
Yeah. Oh, that's so important. Because as you were talking, you were making me think too that, the power of representation, right? And how so often, Native peoples and other peoples of color are written out of, that mainstream history and stories, and how, right, even that story of the burning of the salt, it carries so much with it. And I think sometimes, especially as we're socialized in, school, in our story, we don't hear, our stories or stories of other cultures, that we come to devalue them or not consider them as important, even those, little things.
Mm-hmm. It definitely becomes one of those situations where we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
And so that makes the work of Indigenous storytelling and language, sustaining Native languages, all the more critical.
Definitely. So you talked about it briefly when you were describing some of the authors that you mentioned in your essay. And I wanted to kind of touch base on this again. So how do those concepts of Indigenous storytelling fit within your class structure at OU? You mentioned it briefly with, the non-natives that are in your class and everything. So can you kind of elaborate more about that, like kind of your approach?
Yes, I have been in the practice over the last few years of asking students really across a variety of different courses to include storytelling in their writing assignments. And, my work with storytelling merged with my graduate studies. I worked for the OU Writing Center as a PhD student, and we started doing digital storytelling as a way of working with the communities around campus in public writing workshops. And so I incorporated those models, right, from the public writing workshops into my classes, and asked students to write first-person narratives that relates to course issues and topics. And of course, I teach courses in two different programs in the English department. I teach for Native American literature and cultural studies, and I teach for rhetoric and writing studies. And so it's different to incorporate storytelling into classes on each side of that kind of programmatic split in my professional life. But I can give you a concrete example. I teach a 3,000 level undergraduate course called Stories as Medicine. It is a special topics course, but it takes the title of our talk today. And we read Joe Bruchak's book first, Our Stories Remember. And because Bruchak does such a good job of showing how stories connect communities, connect people within Indigenous communities, connect Indigenous communities to each other, I start by having students write stories about their own communities, right? In an effort to get them to see the way Bruchak is building a bridge between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities in his book. And so students write first-person narratives about where they come from. They tell a story that captures what community means to them, right? Or some central aspect of community that they value. Last spring, I taught a rhetoric and digital humanities course. So the other program that I teach for, and students focused on telling their own stories and then working with members of their own community to tell their stories about life during COVID. Because stories help us process, right? They help us process our experiences, and by reflecting on our experiences and then articulating them with agency, right? Helps us to gain control in a certain sense over our experiences in the world. And COVID has been certainly a time when many people have experienced feeling a loss of control. And so having students to tell stories about their experiences during COVID allowed them to see how storytelling works toward the end of healing, right? One of the ways in which stories function as medicine. So yeah, it's interesting to get students to kind of come out of the headspace of academic discourse where they have to take an objective position away from their material, right? In order to supposedly come closer to unbiased truth, and actually ask them to tell a story that submerges them personally in the topic, right? And gets them to grapple with their own positionality and make connections between course content and their own lives.
Yeah, so it makes me want to write a story now. But I'm also kind of thinking in the back of my mind about something else that you write, in your essay, and that is we speak what we become, right? And it's something that I definitely believe. And I feel like that, if that premise was more ingrained in each of us, right? We'd definitely be more careful about what we say and the words that we use. But I'm also thinking not just to others, but ourselves, right? We all have that negative self-chatter that goes on in our heads. So can you speak a little bit more about that? We speak what we become.
Yes. And I mean, I suppose we could all think of other ways we've heard this put, right? A man is as good as his word would be an old cliche, very gendered cliche at that, but a person is as good as their word, right? And it kind of speaks to the same idea that words are inherently tied to the way that we move through the world, the way that we exist in the world. On a very superficial level, we can't help but judge people by the way they speak, that's one way of thinking about it, but again, a superficial way of thinking about it. In the essay, I talk about how words are animated by breath, and that breath in many Indigenous cultures is a sacred element. I think that because of that, what the notion of we speak what we become gets at for me is what we can do with that, energy in ourselves, right? That sacred animating energy, what we can do, how we can direct it in the world. I think we're often tempted sometimes to think that, again, another cliche, talk is cheap, right? That words come easy, that actions are separate than words, and that actions speak louder than words. But there is a lot of research, across the disciplines that talks about language as socio-political action, right? So the words that we put into the world do act upon the world, right? And sociolinguistics speaks to that. But in Native cultures, I suppose you could think of that as a much more metaphysical process, right? That there is a way in which words are alive and agentive in and of themselves. And for me, I just imagine lining my agency in the world up with my language, right? And making sure that there's an integrity between them. And I think you see this in Joy Harjo's poetry, right? You see the way in which she inhabits her language, right? You see the way in which her precision with words, her precision with metaphors and images is very much a reflection of a great deal, I believe, of, prayerful presence as she writes. At least that's how I imagine her writing in my mind. But I can also feel it in the force of her language. And so for me, that makes it real. So be careful what you speak. There's a tradition at, Cherokee ceremonial grounds of good words, speaking good words. And, camp leaders will come and speak at different parts of the ceremony and in Cherokee. And their words are meant to build the atmosphere, right? To build up the prayer, the energy that is alive, right? And so the words become very much kind of a fuel for the spiritual effort of ceremony in that context. And so they must be good words, right? They must be good words.
Yeah, no, I think that's really powerful. And as you were talking about the cliches, and the other one that came to my mind, it's sort of the antithesis of all of those, just sticks and stones can break my bones, right? That you always hear on the playground as a kid is when I remember,
words can never hurt me. I just wholeheartedly disagree with that, but
yes.
Words can cause a lot of damage, and they may not physically break us, but for Native Americans in particular, our history with the written language, right, serves as a point of proof at the power of words to do harm, right? So
yeah, is this a good point to play Joy Harjo?
This wasn't the point I had in mind.
Okay, that's totally fine.
Okay.
So I'll just screen share. Yeah, you brought up a good point about words being harmful, especially with all the treaties and everything that were definitely involved.
Thank you. This poem is a poem to get rid of fear, and it works. I have before and after pictures. I release you, my beautiful and terrible fear. I release you. You were my beloved and hated twin, but now I don't know you as myself. I release you with all the pain I would know at the death of my children. You are not my blood anymore. I give you back to the soldiers who burned down my home, beheaded my children, raped and sodomized my brothers and sisters. I give you back to those who stole the food from our plates when we were starving. I release you, fear, because you were born, and I was born with eyes that can never close. I release you. I release you. I release you. I release you. I am not afraid to be angry. I am not afraid to rejoice. I am not afraid to be hungry. I am not afraid to be full. I am not afraid to be black. I am not afraid to be white. I am not afraid to be hated. I am not afraid to be loved, to be loved, to be loved. Fear. Oh, you have choked me, but I gave you the leash. You have gutted me, but I gave you the knife. You have devoured me, but I laid myself across the fire. I take myself back, fear. You are not my shadow any longer. I won't hold you in my hands. You can't live in my eyes, my ears, my voice, my belly, or my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart. Your fear. I am alive, and you are so afraid of dying. It's time to start your own business, to turn.
Wow. That was really powerful. It made me think too of what you were talking about, about an invocation. That's what I felt like, that that was. I'd never seen her speak before or read. Well, she wasn't reading, but yeah, speak.
Performing. So. Yeah, She is quite a performer. And when I watch that, I do think it's a good example of the way she speaks herself, right? And speaks reality into her words. Like she sees them very much the same. She's speaking to fear and at the same time ridding herself of it, which speaks to the agency, I think, that she imbues language with. It's very spirited.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, because when you think of fear, right, you think you have no control. At least for me, that's one of the reasons that I get afraid, right? I have no control, right? But using that language and, her voice, then she regains that, like you said, that agency. Yeah. Really makes me think.
Yes.
Thank you.
We should all be speaking to our fear more often.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm also really interested in your work with the activist rhetorical strategies and how that builds these decolonial futures. So for me, that speaks directly to your assertion in your essay that stories are used as a means of persistence and resistance. So can you talk a little bit more about your work?
Yes, I'm kind of swimming in it. So if as I talk about it, I seem to be dog paddling, that's why. I'm in the process of, as an assistant professor, beginning to think through how to move my own dissertation project into a book. And my dissertation project is where, I did the research that the Ford Foundation helped to fund on activist rhetorical strategies in what we can think of as, marginalized spaces in Oklahoma. Because I am so fascinated by the way in which certain stories become silenced, right? Certain threads of history get lost, right? In sort of the suppressive force of dominant discourse, dominant historical narratives that themselves are, of course, informed by settler colonialism, white supremacy, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. Those narratives, those stories have come to supplant the stories of people of color, communities of color. And so my interest is, how can we either work to reverse that trend, right? How can we circulate these stories in a wise way, in an ethical way, for justice? And what I began to see was, as I dug deeper into the histories of, to be specific, Cherokee history and Kiowa history, and Muskogee history, but also African Muskogee history, that for me, my research culminates in the Tulsa Race Massacre. And then also labor history, which in Oklahoma surprisingly became a site of interracial collaboration in the interest of working together for economic justice. We're talking about in the 1910s and teens. So I went into each of these communities to listen, to gather stories from people that I identified as activists, working to sustain these stories, telling these stories, right? Perpetuating these stories. And at the same time, doing the work of sustaining culture, right? Cultural knowledge, which is what I believe storytellers do just innately. It's part of what stories accomplish in the world is the passing on of culture. So I went into each of these communities and I interviewed activists working in the present to do this work. So language workers, cultural workers in Tahlequah and around Tahlequah with Cherokee country, in and around Anadarko, Oklahoma for the Kiowa portion, in and around Rentisville and Tulsa, which is in Muskogee Creek country. And Rentisville is a historically Black town that was founded on a Creek Freedman land. And then in Seminole country, which is the site of an armed rebellion in 1917, anti-war rebellion, anti-draft rebellion, that was carried out by militant labor unionists. So that rebellion is called the Green Corn Rebellion, which takes its name from, the Muskogee Cherokee Southeastern ceremonial calendar. So it's a site of, cross-racial alliances. Makes it interesting to me. And what I wanted to do was at each of these sites, trace out historical legacies. So I also went into the archives and found activists working prior in history whose stories had been untold for the most part, and started tracing out the patterns of how they resisted, using language, because it's, a rhetoric dissertation, but using persuasion, message making, meaning making language to resist, the ever mounting kind of oppression that was coming along with Oklahoma statehood, right? Between removal and statehood, and then after statehood as well, in the early years of Oklahoma as a state. So looking at their practices, comparing them to practices in the present, to ultimately argue the suppression didn't work, right? It didn't work. These practices have persisted. And here's what we can learn from them now, right? Here's what we can learn from the people doing this work now in order to help them, to help the public, to help our students in our classrooms, to listen to these stories, value these stories, and reshape their worldviews by including them in their own understanding of who they are and where they come from.
Definitely.
Yeah, it almost seems like it's like a double reclamation in some ways, because, in historical writings and thoughts, right, the written word is always given so much more precedence, right? That's the objective
Yes.
telling.
Experiential knowledge does not get a whole lot of credit, especially in academic environments. And to me, lived experiences are our first teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as you explained all of that, which was great and amazing, that, there needs to be more emphasis in past stories and legacies. Can you kind of talk about, from a personal standpoint, what has been the most challenging factor of your work and how did you overcome it?
Yeah, I definitely can. There's so many different challenges. But I would say first and foremost, it would be the biggest challenge to my work has been overcoming the distance that federal policy has created between me and my own, cultural identity. By really confronting the fact that, removal policy, assimilation policy, all the different ways that the federal government worked to destroy Native cultures, right, and Native identities, I embody, right? I'm the product of those policies. Native Americans are a product of that policy. We carry that with us. And so reclaiming my own identity in a way, bringing my parts together. I don't know how else to explain it, Freddie. It was like split off in a certain sense. And I had to do the work of saying, it's important that I do this, right? It's important that I don't allow this part of my family's identity to disappear, right? Of my own identity to disappear. So that has been a real central challenge that thankfully I think I'm on the other side of, and now I get to talk to students who feel even more distance from their cultures than I did, and encourage them and say, in a way, helping them to understand that it's a duty. It's a way of honoring what's been taken away by reclaiming it. So that would be a central challenge. I would also say even getting folks to think in terms of story, in public workshops or even in my classrooms or in my talks, we're so displaced from our stories. And that's the impact of settler colonialism on all of us, right? When many times even when people come to a storytelling workshop or space, you ask them to tell a story, they're kind of, rattled because they're not even sure what it means to tell a story, or they don't believe they have a story that's worth telling. So getting people to value story and their own stories and get into what I think is actually a very natural and organic headspace, storytelling, getting them to settle into that space is surprisingly challenging. I think the other difficulty, a couple of things, is speaking the truth about Native American history, the full truth, which sometimes includes family history, balancing that trauma and what can only be thought of as tragedy, injustice, balancing that truth with the adjacent truth that Native American peoples continued, right? And how to emphasize that strength and that resilience, while at the same time telling the dark truth is a challenge, right? Not getting absorbed into loss and disappearance and violence, right? And the tragedy of the history, but choosing to emphasize the perseverance, right? The continuance. And then finally, I think anytime you work in Native studies, or certainly African American studies, I suppose everybody's history has trauma. Everybody's history has trauma, and stories are one way to approach that trauma. And many times people go there, so I would say navigating those kind of trauma-informed stories has been another challenge for me, knowing how to help storytellers through the connections they're making in their own lives, and be present and help them to shape a narrative that allows them to gain agency over the story and heal, is definitely a challenging task, but an important one, and to me a sacred one.
Definitely, that's a lot of powerful stuff you said right there. It could have been developed into a poem as you spoke. So this is my last question, and then we'll go into some Q&As. We do have some questions, so we'll follow up with that after, but this is my final question. So why is it important for tribal nations and governments to begin developing more digital records and collections detailing their stories and history?
Well, because our elders are valuable, and we are, I think, across Indigenous cultures, with each generation that passes, we are another generation away from cultures prior to contact or at earlier stages of contact. And so their knowledge and their memories and their stories become so precious beyond words. That these digital archives are the way to, number one, gather and house their knowledge, but then also they're very accessible, right? So, one of the things that I talk with my colleague, my friend, my grandma, Dorothy Whitehorse Stallone, she is a Kiowa elder and one of the last living first language speakers. She's 80, she just turned 89. And one of the things that she talks about with digital archives is this concern that allowing people access to these stories and this knowledge is somehow dangerous. You can't blame Native Americans for fearing that, right? The ways in which particularly academic institutions have exploited Native cultural knowledge is historic, right? We're only barely making moves in the direction of working with communities instead of in them or for them. working with communities, giving communities the lead on these projects. But what she says is, we have to give access. We're at the point where in order to give our own people access, we have to give everyone access, right? And this knowledge was originally, for her at least, in the Kiowa culture, intended for everyone, intended to be shared. Some of it, of course, is sacred to particular ceremonial practices. That knowledge won't be shared. But when we're talking about stories and histories and language and songs, we're talking about knowledge that she very much wants to continue and survive. So even me as a non-Kiowa, as a Cherokee scholar, she's always encouraging me in my Kiowa language use and in teaching Kiowa culture and stories and songs, because to her, we're at the point where we need everybody's help. We need everybody's help. We need well-intentioned people with good hearts to have access so that they can help.
Definitely. So that was it for Dr. Mendoza and I's questions, and we'll transition to some of the Q&A. I think I'll start with this chat comment for us. It says, Dr. Jackson, as an international psychologist with a focus on Indigenous cultures, it appears we are sailing sister ships on Turtle Island. I have recently presented on the lack of inclusion in the Academy of Indigenous Research Methodologies. Story is a major portion for all Indigenous research. I speak to other ways such as drumming, singing, dancing, also valid medians to express story. I totally agree too. I would love the opportunity to have a discussion with you sometime on our mutual concerns, etc. Thank you for this great presentation and information, Dr. Joyce Frey. So that's some love from the chat right there. And so here's the question from Caitlin Savage. Joy Harjo brings her whole body to her poetry and performance. Is there a tradition of this with earlier Indigenous poets? And the follow-up question is, are there other Native poets working today that you recommend?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, performance, particularly among women and men, performance in Native American history is something that, we tend to think about developing around the time of the Wild West show, right? So late 1880s, early 1890s. And you did see a variety of Native American performers who saw performance, right, as problematic as it was, particularly in the context of Wild West shows, but who saw performance as a vehicle for growth, right, for personal growth, for community growth as well, bringing resources and assets to Indigenous communities. So yes, you definitely had performers. I am working in my mind to come up with some names, and I think I'm just too nervous to do that. But I think of, I'm not that well, there was Teata, of course. Teata was a Chickasaw performer. She was a storyteller. The Chickasaw Nation has just put out a film about her. It is spelled Teata, Teata. And I think what's interesting is that Teata in particular definitely imagined herself as a teacher, right? She was a storyteller and performer. She often sang, she played a hand drum. And she thought of herself as a teacher, an ambassador, and most certainly was understood in that way by her audiences as a kind of diplomat. And I think this is the role that many Native women performers inhabited, like that they were liaisons, cultural liaisons. So yeah, very interesting history there. As far as other poets, I think it's Natalie Diaz, her book, Post-Colonial Love Poems. I hope I've got that right. She is won the Pulitzer. So I would definitely recommend her book. Other poets, I love N. Scott Momaday's poetry, his essay writing. His essay is very much very poetic. His voice, I think, would be aptly described as poetic, just even when he speaks at random. So I would go with those two. If I think of some more as we're talking, I'll shout them out.
Yeah, and so we have another question from an anonymous attendee. So it said, you mentioned the sacredness of good words and how careful we need to be with them. I don't think this is the case for European cultures. Do you have any recommendations on how to develop habits for using words and languages more carefully?
Well, I'll first start by saying that this is a practice that I am still working on myself. I think it's a lifelong practice. Stillness is important to the process. I think that's something that in and of itself we struggle with, and that sometimes our words come out of us before we have fully fashioned them with any kind of intentional agency. And so building stillness into life, generally, silence, quietness, right? Listening to the rhythms of your own thoughts, your own emotions, I think is your breath, right? Is central to understanding how it is to be more conscious of your words. Noticing them before they come out of you, right? Thinking about where they come from. Where are they coming from? Joy Harjo even admits in her book, Poet Warrior, her memoir, that sometimes words come to her from other people, right? They're not even, she might just be near them in proximity. I mean, I'm open to believing that we never know where we might be getting energetic influence or picking up things that do not belong to us. So I would say stillness is the place to start. And other than that, remaining whole, I think, is important. This is a maybe an abstract concept, but the idea of at least Cherokee traditional medicine is very much built on the notion that you are whole, right? That all of your parts are integrated, right? There's not a little bit of you out here running around in a space other than the one that you're in, but having all of your pieces together, right? Calling all of your parts back into wholeness, into yourself, is an important part of moving through the world in the right way. So I would say our words emanate from who we are at the same time that they create who we are. It's a closed feedback loop in that regard. So working to know who you are, to be still, and to listen to yourself before speaking to others, I think is the best I could say.
I really appreciate that, because in our culture, I feel like, we have to be quick, and I'm a person who has to think about it, words just don't come to me repartee, it's not easy for me. And the next day I'll think of, oh, that's what I should have said. Right. So I appreciate you really, putting that into a different perspective. And that also brings me back to something you said earlier in our discussion about listening, right? Because I also feel like that's something that's often overlooked in our culture, right? Because we want to speak and get our words out, but the importance of listening oftentimes gets overlooked.
Oh, and it's so hard to teach students that, right? How to listen. We were just talking about this in my class, teaching a class on tribally specific literatures this semester, and we're of course reading Joy Harjo, and she speaks a lot in Poet Warrior about learning how to listen. She's very much, the book is interspersed with poems where she's writing about kind of from the spirit realm, her spirit being guided, right? Being guided by, ancestors and other spirit guides into her role as a poet warrior. And one of the first poems from this space in the book is very much about preparing her to listen, right? to come into the world to listen. And I think my students are, what does it mean? Like, well, she's also teaching us how to listen in this book, right? She's providing a model for how she did it, right? What she was listening to, when she was listening. And one of my students say, yeah, there's a passage in the book where she talks about listening to a sunset, and everybody just got quiet, in the class. And I'm like, okay, how do you do that? But because silence is such an integral part of Native communication practices, of Indigenous communication practices, you will encounter a lot of silence in Native spaces, and it's comfortable. It's comfortable. And so I asked my students to think, well, are there ways that we can listen to sunsets? What are you listening to when you listen to a sunset? None of us could articulate it. So finally, I started talking about how stories continue to teach us. And sometimes when we're thinking about our own stories, right, or the stories we know or we've been told or someone else's story, we're not hearing it, but we're listening to it, right? It's still in our heads. It's in our hearts. It's continuing to teach us. It's continuing to be told. It's continuing to unfold. And so there are ways we can listen without hearing, right? They're kind of, in some ways, two different steps.
Yeah, I like that. And thank you so much, because I feel like, things that I've been thinking about myself as being inadequate, now I'm going to think about them as superpowers.
Yeah.
I had another question for you, because I know you do some work in this as well, and I wanted you to speak to it, because I feel like we can't talk about Indigenous storytelling without talking about Indigenous languages. So can you talk about your work in that and how those two play together?
Yes, I'm the very fortunate recipient of some good fate in my life in certain situations, and I first got involved with sustaining Indigenous languages through the work that I do with the Kiowas, which I've been working with the Kiowa for 15 years. Wow. But it's kind of it was a Oklahoma Humanities Council project, started a comparative humanities course, college level comparative humanities course through our public liberal arts college here in Oklahoma, which is University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma in Chickasha. And I was hired as an adjunct to be the Western scholar, right, in a course where I worked with Kiowa elders to develop course content. Now, each week we had a topic. It could be, let's say, for instance, like property. And I would bring in something from a Western canon, and a Kiowa elder would bring in something from Kiowa tradition that spoke to that same topic. And then we'd have a comparing two ways of knowing conversation. And increasingly, after I started working with the course, there was always a language lesson component in the course from the beginning. And increasingly, I noticed that the participants in the course were very uninterested in what, for instance, John Locke had to say about property. What they were coming to the course for was their access to their own cultural knowledge, access to the elders. We'd be in the middle of the class talking about, something esoteric from the West, and a student would raise their hand and ask a question about the language. How do you say this? Totally taking the conversation a different direction. And there just kind of came a moment where I realized that this was commentary on the course content, and we needed to drop the Western stuff. So that's how we started focusing on Kiowa stories, song, language. It's a community course. These are all Kiowa people, some Kiowa Apache. Of course, we get Comanches as well because of the relationship between the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Apache. But they come to class, and we have an elder who teaches, kind of curates the content just out of the course of conversation. There's no way to reasonably expect that we'll follow a course calendar. we have a reading each week that we read together in class from a text that the elder helps select, usually by a Kiowa author or an authorized anthropologist sort of working with the Kiowa. And Dorothy will spontaneously think of a song that goes along with the content or that's adjacent to it, a word, a prayer, a story. And as those stories come up, my job is to transcribe the Kiowa language using a particular spelling system created by Alicia Kibon Gonzalez, who was herself Kiowa Apache, and transcribe the Kiowa language, translate it into English, and keep notes so that students can see the language written, see it transcribed, practice it as it's coming to her, as she's curating the lesson for that night. So a few years ago, we started building a website, Recording Dorothy. You can access the lessons that she teaches in short videos on our website, kiowatalk.org. It is a digital archive, right, that we're trying to build with an eye on making it something that others might be able to replicate. It is grant funded. It's not funded by the university. And, wanting to, I think in part, think through the ways that we can train community members to do digital archiving work using very simple tools, building their literacy around those tools so that, every Native person has an elder in their family that we need to record, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we engage communities in doing this work in a grassroots kind of way? That's what the project at this point is trying to imagine.
That sounds amazing. Thank you.
So as we wrap up toward the hour, I don't think we have any more questions coming in. You actually answered one of the attendees, which is Julie Mulville. You answered her question already. So if that's the case, we can kind of follow into the closing remarks. So we'd like to extend our sincerest appreciation to Dr. Rachel Jackson and to those in the audience today for today's big idea discussion titled Story as Medicine. Join us next week on February 23rd as Humanities Kansas welcomes Joy Harjo, citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation, in the 23rd U.S. Poet Laureate and the first Native American to hold the title, for an online presentation in partnership with Haskell Indian Nations University, the Lawrence Public Library, and the Hall Centers for Humanities at the University of Kansas. To register, please click the link below in the chat box, which is right here. There you go. Oh, that was to Dr. Mendoza. Whoops. Yeah,
Freddie, I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
I don't know if my email address is shared with anybody. I know someone requested the possibility of being in touch. I would love to hear from anybody. My email address is rcjackson@ou.edu. It's an ironic last name for a Cherokee scholar. It's RC Jackson.
Sorry, hi, I'm here. So yeah, that's your email if you want to contact Dr. Jackson. Also join us next month on March 10th at 12 p.m. for another big idea discussion featuring Dr. Daryl Monto, enrolled member of the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma and current SACNAS Native Initiatives Manager, as we focus on Indigenous education and higher education attainment and the historical impacts and cultural factors facing tribal programs and governments today. So that's next month on March 10th for the next big idea. That pretty much wraps it all up. I don't have anything else to say. Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for taking the time. Dr. Mendoza, do you have any closing remarks that you want to kind of say before we end?
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, and everyone for attending.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you both. Yeah.
Yeah, have a great rest of your day and have a great weekend. And hopefully our paths will twine soon. So take care.
Okay.